All you delicious people, I'm here today to review a movie called All Superheroes Must Die. If anything, regardless of how low budget that this movie may seem, I think that there is some interesting potential within this film. I think honestly, while watching this film actually very much reminds me of a comic book called Avengers Arena, where we have a bunch of nobody like superheroes going up against a villain people could be very familiar with, and they are basically led to eventually be killed off or otherwise to be pushed to the brink of using their powers to make it through these obstacle like courses, which is basically fairly similar to what's going on in this story. But in the very beginning of this story, we end up having every single superhero lose every little bit of their superpowers. And so, with the exception of a character named Charge, it seems like he was immune to this injection, which everyone was given in the very beginning of this movie. In all honesty, there are quite a bit of times within this movie where people are just walking around nowhere to where you're just like, okay, what is the point of this scene? Like, get us to the point of understanding why this part is important. Um, but uh, with that, also, there are points in time when you do see them get to the point and you do see them get to a very uh, interesting part of story, which gets us to invest in the heroes, even though I honestly could invest in the villain more than the heroes. It kind of feels like a lot of them uh, do not have enough uh, like drastic change of personality to me. I think that that is the biggest problem within this film is I don't feel that we have enough like differences of characters to where they either have a certain persona or they have some kind of like if you look at like a perfect example would be if you look at this and you look at a movie like The Suicide Squad or Suicide Squad, you can have it to where every single one of those characters are very individually looking. You could tell that um, like the Joker is wildly different from Killer Croc, and you could tell that Harley Quinn is drastically different from uh, Deadshot, and so on and so forth. Like every one of those characters are so individual. Like El Diablo has his own set of powers that, of course, is drastically different than anyone else on the team. And when looking at this, like you basically just have a bunch of people all dressed up in tights, and what difference do they actually have? Like, we end up having it to where I guess Cutthroat could be said that he is very good at throwing daggers or throwing knives. But what else did he have besides that? And plus, on top of that, it seems like a lot of these levels, these objectives, these whatever, none of these were actually tailor made for any of these superheroes. It just kind of feels like um, a lot of them were just kind of like randomly put together because somebody had an idea. It just kind of feels like, oh, okay, how about we just have Charge? How about he just wrestle some guy? Yeah, that seems interesting. While some bomb is going off. Okay. Like, we end up having it to where if you go ahead and watch a movie called Funhouse, which I think was like 2019, something along those lines. Like if you probably go into a Play Ultra or something like that, or a Movie Pro or something like that, you could probably see this movie called Funhouse. If anything, it kind of feels that um, like those objectives or those obstacle course like things that everyone has to go into, those were all fairly low budget as well. But a lot of the things going on into those missions that everyone was placed into were really honestly very fascinating. At some points, yeah, there was some missions where it was basically just like, okay, uh, uh, two axes drop on the floor and two people have to fight it out. Like that's where some of the objectives were. But I could also say that once we get further along into this movie, it honestly feels like the missions or the rounds that they were doing do kind of get better. But I would also say, like, well, they didn't have a good enough like point to them. They didn't have a good enough uh like there wasn't a good enough build to any of the levels, the rounds, the whatever. It's basically just like, hey, just every single round you're going to die, so what does it matter? That's kind of what it felt like. It kind of felt just like, well, how about every single one of these superheroes all just kill themselves right now, and then this whole thing will be over with? Because that's basically what uh, Rickshaw basically says. Is it's basically every single round is to basically have every single one of these superheroes die. But here's also the thing: if every single one of these superheroes were to die, every single one of these bombs that Rickshaw was to have placed, every single one of these civilians would have died anyways. So, really and honestly and truly looking at it, the villain would have won regardless. It would have basically been that if the superheroes would have taken their lives, the villains would have still been killed off. If the superheroes would have saved these people, I'm sure the people would have died anyways. The people would have died regardless. And so, really, when looking at it, there's actually nothing to. There was nothing to have these heroes win a grand prize at the end of this. Basically, the whole point of this story was eventually to have the heroes get to the villain and find out where exactly he is posting these videos. I think if they would have just realized how pointless all these objectives were and tried to go after the villain, one, this movie would have been a lot shorter. But if anything, they would have gotten to the point of this story a lot quicker. To just be like, oh, okay, well, the villains win, or the heroes win because the villain is taken out. Because basically, the villain has all kinds of control of all of these obstacles, so they needed to find him instead of taking the time to just do all of these useless uh, obstacle course like runs. Because reasonably, whoever that they would have sent on these, like, it would have been interesting if one person the entire time was trying to infiltrate uh, Rickshaw. Like, it would have been interesting if Charge would have taken upon himself to have all these other heroes go and do these obstacle courses, and Charge would have gone and if you guys ever seen the movie, the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie Running Man, you end up having Arnold and a lot of his people all going and doing the whatever the next obstacle course is. But then eventually we have one person or two people who are also trying to hack into this satellite to try and figure out how uh, to get away from here, to escape. And like I think that that's the way that this movie should have been done all along. But it is what it is. But anyways, so going into this movie, let's go into spoilers. Really, there is some honestly downtime within this movie. because there is quite a bit of times where characters are just kind of walking around. So it is kind of just like, okay, let's get to the point. But really, there is this time of helping us understand what environment that these people are in. And so I guess I can give them that. But with that said, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So all superheroes must die. So in the very beginning of this film, we end up having seemingly four different superheroes all wake up in this deserted town. I'm like, this seems kind of overkill to be in a deserted town with four whole superheroes in it. I'm like, if there was like 10 superheroes, then I could understand, oh, okay, like I can understand why they were in a deserted town. But like four superheroes in a deserted town kind of seems overkill. Like if anything, like all four of these superheroes could have woken up in some junkyard, and I think I would have bought the story just as well. Um, we could have had it to where Rickshaw was just in uh, some junk home in uh, in this junkyard, and probably would have sold it just as well. But anyways, but good on these people for having this deserted town, I guess. But anyways, so and who knows how exactly that this was shot? Maybe they just found certain locations uh, to have people not be there, and so on and so. Who knows? But anyways, by the way, I think there was a sequel to this movie. I don't know if I said that already. Um, it would be interesting to find where that sequel was because I'd like to see like eventually if the sequel had gotten a bigger budget or like I kind of am interested to see like if they would have completely done a reboot or changed the cast, or it would have been interesting to see if they would have given us a better story within the sequel. I don't know. But anyways, we end up going along and having these people all waking up with needles in their arms, waking up to these deserted town like environments, just looking around and just very baffled and or confused. We end up having Wall, who ends up kind of walking into seeing two people that are already dead. We end up having Cutthroat, who ends up waking up in some restaurant and or whichever, and we end up having a civilian who is angry at Cutthroat because this civilian is yelling at Cutthroat because Cutthroat is the reason why this guy is there, tied up next to a bomb, and so we end up having Charge, who is to wake up with a needle in his arm, but unfortunately he still has his powers. We end up having Shadow, who ends up, of course, needle and arm, whichever. So we end up having eventually Rickshaw coming onto the TV to eventually help all these superheroes understand that he, I guess, is a supervillain. We have no backstory of this supervillain, as if we are to naturally assume that this villain is their consistent nemesis, but there is no history to help us understand that. So we end up having Rickshaw, who is to come on here and to basically let everybody know that there is a plethora of rounds for these people to go through, and this game is being put together, and we really have it to where Rickshaw is pointing out that eventually he has a detonator for all of these bombs, and that eventually if these people don't succeed, bombs will go off, and if anything, if all the superheroes fail, then the entire town will go off. And we end up having it to where also Rickshaw needs to showcase how he's willing to just kill people by where Cutthroat is. The civilian in Cutthroat's location ends up getting blown up. And so Cutthroat ends up opening the place of which that this civilian was at to have a reaction of, oh, this guy died. Oh, that sucks. And then he ends up moving on. So we are to have Cutthroat gather these people up together to have them go to some location just to separate them apart again, to basically have Charge and Cutthroat go onto their round, and to have the Wall and the Shadow go onto their round. We end up finding out that it seems that Shadow is kind of mixed between two different men. It seems that Shadow at some point had a relationship with the Wall, but also she has had a seemingly relationship with Charge, which it seems that Shadow is much more romantically tied to Charge. So we end up going on and having Charge and Cutthroat go to their round. So we end up having it seemingly that we have Charge, who is to go and wrestle a guy named Sledgesaw in a cage match, while Cutthroat is to try and defuse some bomb, and because we have the traditional like lighter fuse like bomb thing where it's like a bomb on a string kind of approach, and then eventually once this bomb completely hits the fuse, it goes off. Of course, it's the traditional bomb approach. So we end up having Cutthroat, who is trying to cut this string, but he has nothing to cut it with. And eventually, when they even try, because Charge ends up just beating down this the sledge saw like character, which I'm like, okay, so what if they would have just never gone and fought out the sledge saw like character in his cage? What would have happened then if they didn't go? Would they have failed the mission? I'm confused. But anyways, we end up having Charge, who ends up beating down Sledgesaw, and then he ends up taking some kind of axe of sorts and chopping the dynamite that ends up taking these two characters to think that, oh yeah, we won, we beat it. But then eventually the fuse relits, and so it just seems like this bomb is never going to get defused. And so we end up eventually having these civilians all explode and die off, which we are basically to naturally assume that every single one of these civilians are going to end up this way eventually. What we are to naturally assume. So we end up having eventually Shadow and the Wall going up against a guy named Manpower. We end up having this guy at first seemingly have some flamethrower, but eventually once the heroes get much more close to him, we end up finding out that Manpower just has a knife of sorts, because reasonably dangerous things and whatever what have you. We end up having this Manpower guy dressing up in stilts and having some kind of Uncle Sam like get up with him. So we end up having eventually that Shadow is to try and attack Manpower, but we end up having Manpower basically overpowering Shadow and taking her out, because she thought that Manpower wouldn't have seen her because she was trying to use her power as, I guess, being a shadow. So we end up having Manpower, who ends up taking out Shadow, and so we end up having now Manpower, who is going to try and fight the Wall, and it seems like he's very successful at that. We end up having Manpower, who ends up going and taking down the Wall, and he ends up deciding that he wants to cut open the Wall, and so of course that's what he ends up doing. Manpower ends up slicing open the Wall, and we end up having the Wall, who is now bleeding to death. And so we eventually have it to where Charge and Cutthroat ending up arriving to otherwise being able to help in taking down Manpower. And so we eventually have it to where we end up noticing that that the Wall is now bleeding, and so we end up having Charge, who ends up checking on the Wall to realize that he needs to now lie to the wall. To basically say, hey man, like, it's okay, like, you're gonna make it out of this. Like, if anything, this is just a flesh wound. You're fine. Because we end up having the wall, who I guess has never been hurt in his entire life. Here's the thing, though. It seems that within this story, it seems that it's not actually all well and defined when exactly that these people were to have gotten their powers. It seems that they had mentioned somewhere in this story, because a lot about these superheroes are so really vague in this film, you can't quite exactly understand exactly what the backstory of these characters all are. But it seems that every single one of these characters had all gotten their powers at the exact same time. We are to assess or to assume. So the wall kind of mentioning that he has never felt pain before. I'm like, well, like, was he a silver spoon-ish like person his entire life, and he never actually like had gotten hurt like before he actually got superpowers? So it was a coincidence that like, so he's never been punched in the face, he's never been kicked in the Johnson, he's never been whatever before he ended up getting these superpowers? Okay, he's never had a flu, nothing. Like, he's been perfectly fine his whole entire life. Um, but then again, like, this story can just be written however. But anyways, so we end up having the Wall, who, again, like, if his powers were that he was bulletproof, or his powers were, like, what exactly? That he was strong like a wall? Like, he was, like, I just don't quite understand exactly what his powers were. Because reasonably, he wasn't on the screen enough for us to understand what actually his powers were. Um, as well as any number of these superheroes, you didn't really understand who of what of any of those powers were for any of these people, because they never had them on screen anywhere. But anyways, we end up going along because recently they didn't have their powers because they would have had to use like special effects, or they would have done any number of things which they couldn't have actually done in this film. But anyways, so we end up having it to where we go along and we are to have Shadow now comfort the Wall, because it seems that that charge mentions how Shadow and the Wall were close to one another, which they end up having to show some flashback of them, I guess, kissing or hugging or whatever. I'm like, okay, well, did they have a relationship and it didn't work out? Like, were they actually boyfriend girlfriend, and like, was Shadow cheating on the Wall with Charge? What was that story there? A lot of stuff was kind of very severely, again, vague within these characters, where you didn't exactly understand, was Charge Shadow's true love, but reasonably she just settled for the Wall? What was this story? I would have guessed let's go. I guess we'll have to figure. I guess we'll just say that like Shadow was cheating on two men. That's the story. Let's go with that, because that just seems very underhanded, and that seems to be a better story out of all the stuff that I've just been thinking about. So, with that said, and I guess it's convenient now that the Wall is dead. So now that like Shadow is like, well, I guess I only have one boyfriend left. In all honesty, because there was nothing vague. There was something vague about that. But anyways, so we end up having it to where Shadow is trying to ask if there is any way to heal the Wall. Is there any other way that they can find some med kit, some first aid, some whatever? And Charge is convincing her, it's like, well, there's no way to cure him. There's no way to help him. There isn't a healer here. It's not going to work. Because reasonably you can't fix a 12-inch stab wound. It's not going to happen. He's going to bleed out. He is going to die. It's just a matter of time. But Charge ending up trying to comfort the Wall and lie to him that he'll be okay was just a thing to just tell him, to where Shadow is going to have to go to the Wall and comfort him until he dies, which will probably be fairly soon. So we end up having it to where we go along here and we end up having seemingly, once the Wall dies, we end up having the Shadow and Charge and Cutthroat going to eventually this diner where Shadow was to tell us that the Wall had said that he had felt better, and when he was to feel better, he was to die. Sadly enough, tears of sadness. So, tears of sadness for a character that we barely knew and died and didn't have much of any lines of anything going on in this movie for us to kind of invest in this character. Like, eventually we end up having, the Wall talking to Charge, and eventually they ended up, like, shaking hands, and like, the Wall was like, oh my god, you're like you're so strong still. And, like, that was, like, the real thing of which that the Wall had done. But other than that, it's like, Wall's basically dead. Who cares? So going on, we end up having it to where we are to go to this diner of sorts to have Rickshaw tell us that, or no. The next, I think the next thing was to have all these people go to this next round, this bonus round. So we end up having both Shadow, Cutthroat, and Charge go to this one obstacle course, where the whole thing of it is that there was three coffins lined up, and there was also three people all attached to these bombs. And so the round was that that they need to have every single one of these superheroes shoot themselves and to fall into the coffins, and that were to save all of these citizens that are strapped to bombs. Well, we end up having Charge, who ends up grabbing the gun, and he ends up taking and is going to pull the trigger upon himself to almost fall into these coffins. But instead, we end up having Charge, who ends up shooting all the civilians and saying, like, okay, well, like, basically we solved that. To where it's like, basically, we need to keep ourselves alive to see if we can eventually save somebody. And so that's what we're going to do. So we eventually push on to eventually go to some diner. Here's where we go into here. So we end up having all of these weapons all of a sudden appear. And so we are to have this fight out now, because we end up finding out that it seems that Cutthroat's sister is otherwise tied to one of these bombs, to where now we have it to where Cutthroat is going to have to turn onto this entire group to try to save his sister. I'm like, well, why not just try and get through the bomb, like cut through the bomb, or do something to make it to where the bomb does not go off? I guess if they would have tried to defuse the bomb, that's when I guess Rickshaw would have made the bomb go off and would have killed Cutthroat's sister anyways. You would have think that they would have maybe tried to, like, defuse any of these bombs. I don't know, I guess maybe none of these people have these expertise, because it's kind of obvious that none of these characters have any kind of traits to them or characteristics that were just like, oh, this is bomb defusal man. Oh, as long as also him being or having some other kind of side superpower. we end up having it to where Cutthroat, I think, is the only like person that has something unique to him to where he can, I guess, throw daggers. Everyone else is just kind of like, well, without my superpowers, I have nothing. So we end up going along and having it to where Cutthroat is to fight Charge, and eventually we end up having Shadow, who ends up going and holding a gun between the two of them to try to stop them from fighting, and so on and so forth. So we eventually end up having a backstory showcasing both Charge uh, and Cutthroat having this disagreement about what they're doing. But also eventually we also have some moment where we also have to show these four superheroes eventually becoming superheroes, and that's another flashback, showcasing to us of how they all come to the consensus like, well, hey, we all have superpowers. Why don't we become superheroes? And we eventually have Cutthroat who mentions like, well, what happens if we are to make a dent against somebody? Like, they're probably eventually going to come after us, right? And so I think that is the real true moment of which that we have to realize that I guess this is the dent in this whole metaphor of whichever. Anyways, so we eventually also find out that it seems that Charge was a side or that Cutthroat was a sidekick of Charge, and so funny enough, we never actually have Cutthroat evidently know that Charge does not actually have legitimate superpowers. I guess he just eventually is just super strong because he is super strong, I guess. Because we end up having the needle not affecting him because he didn't get his superpowers the way of which that everyone else did, um, and so on and so forth. So we eventually have it to where Cutthroat is to eventually throw a dagger at Shadow, and eventually we end up having it to where Charge has to kill Cutthroat. To where eventually we have Cutthroat who eventually falls off to the side and goes like, man, I just want to let you know before you die, I was always jealous. I was always jealous of you. And we end up finding out that it seems that Cutthroat was jealous of Charge, because it seems that he was always the leader, he was always the best of them, and so on and so forth. And so we eventually end up having it to where Cutthroat ends up dying, but also so does his sister, sadly enough, because Cutthroat did not win, so Cutthroat's sister died. Like, to me, I would honestly think that I kind of wish that a lot of these objectives were honestly kind of like the Arena 2011 film with Samuel L. Jackson. If anything, there are times where, like, yeah, that movie, it's like you have to fight and win, but there was also some like special objectives that people had to do within some of those fights as well through that movie. But anything, I think I'm kind of referencing so many things outside of here but this movie because, like, I wish there was a lot more going on with this film. I think it would be fascinating. So, going on into this, we end up having it to where Cutthroat is now dead. Now there's only two. Oh, that's too bad. So, we end up having it to now where Charge is to eventually figure out seemingly that that Rickshaw. It seems that this character is to be putting on a performance nearby of where they are actually located, because we end up having it uh, to where Charge notices that there are small detonation things upon these bombs, and the ways of which that this person would put on this show had to be somewhere where they could triangulate it to where eventually this guy would be in a certain location, because reasonably the frequency of a lot of these TVs like whenever you are to see a very off distance frequency TV, eventually you are to realize like if the frequency of the TV is a lot better, then it must be somewhere close to where Rickshaw is performing. So we have it to where Charge has figured all of this out, that it has to be very all short range like things. And so we end up having both Charge and Shadow needing to go to the next objective. So basically the next objective is like, hey guys, here's a gun, shoot one of you, and the last person basically just wins this show, wins this round, wins this game. And so we end up having Charge, who ends up telling Shadow to shoot him in a very convincing way to make it look like he is going to die. And so while Shadow is to run around for the very last final objective, Charge is going to go and run off to find Rickshaw and try to stop him. So we end up having Shadow, who ends up easily just pulling the trigger on Charge and like, yeah, I hated you anyways, I hope you die. Plow! And so Charge is dead, and the movie ends. Oh, that's too bad. No. So we end up having Shadow, who is like, well, like, I guess since I had two boyfriends anyways in this movie, I guess I'll just have none. So we end up having Shadow, who ends up shooting Charge, and he ends up falling over. But, like, we have it to where Rickshaw never confirms Charge's death. But we end up having Shadow, who ends up just running around all around town to where it doesn't even make sense anymore, for her to eventually find the next objective, the next thing, the next cool hot place. So we end up having Shadow, who ends up making it to her objective, and it's yet another bomb objective, whichever that is. And so we end up having Charge making his way to eventually go to find Rickshaw's headquarters. And so we end up having Charge, who ends up having to take down some goons of Rickshaw, some guys in these bizarrish, mascotish like costumes. And so Charge ends up taking them down to make his way to Rickshaw, to where we end up having Rickshaw, who is in utter surprise, is like, oh my god, you found me! And Charge is like, yeah. And so we end up having Charge, who ends up shooting Rickshaw and killing him. And so we end up having Rickshaw, who, for the fact that just in utter, like, grievance or utter just irritation, we end up having Rickshaw deciding to blow up the entire town by turning the microwave on. Okay, evidently there's some microwave bomb that can take out this entire town. Okay, sure, and it's 5 minutes in length. Okay, so we end up having Charge, who ends up going on to the telly and telling Shadow, hey, like, I did it. I killed Rickshaw. Like, everything's good. But the problem is there's going to be a big, huge bomb that's going to obliterate this entire town. You better make a run for it. You better try to get out of this town. And so we end up instead having Shadow just running all over the place, just running all over this town. And we end up having Charge figuring out that it's like, oh, she's trying to find me. She's trying to get to me. Like, don't come after me. You're going to die doing that. And so we end up having Shadow making it to Charge, and eventually grabbing him and picking him up while Charge is bleeding to death, mentioning to Rickshaw that he'll see him soon. We end up having Shadow seeing Charge and just like picking them up and having them both try to get out of here. And we end up having Charge tell Shadow, it's like, well, you only have a couple minutes left. Like, it's basically like trying to get out of here in a wheelchair. It's not going to work all that well. And so we end up having Shadow just confirming to Charge, like, well, hey, like, if I don't get out of here with you, then I don't get out of here, kind of thing. So we end up having both of them trying to walk out of here, and eventually that just is how the movie ends, with us not exactly confirming if everyone dies or not. But I guess we are to probably assume that they are to probably just make it out of there, because who knows? Because sequel would tell us, I don't know. I've never seen the sequel. So we are probably to naturally assume that Charge probably does die, and Shadow probably goes to the sequel, maybe? I don't know. I haven't seen the sequel. I'm kind of interested in maybe just seeing the trailer of the sequel, just to see if there's anybody that ends up coming back, or they probably just recycle uh, certain characters and just make it to just be like, well, if anything, all of these actors really wanted to come back for the sequel movie, so I just made them completely different characters, or like the sequel doesn't tie to the original movie. Dot to dot dot dot. But with that said, I think I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.